The day the woman I called my mother died, my world didn't just end. It dissolved into a fine gray ash, leaving me gasping in a vacuum of my own making. For 58 years, Agatha Monroe had been the sun in my solitary sky, a celestial body of immense gravity around which my entire existence orbited. Her death was an extinction-level event. I wept for a week, a raw, primal grief that left me hollowed out, my throat sore from a sound I didn't recognize as my own. I clutched at the memories of her, the cool, dry touch of her hand on my forehead, the precise, measured cadence of her voice reading classic novels to me by the fireside, the ubiquitous scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, her furniture, the very air in the house we shared. She was my mother, my mentor, my entire world. And I had loved her with a devotion that felt as natural and necessary as breathing. A week after her quiet passing, I found myself sitting in a sterile, wood-paneled office that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. It was the office of Mr. Thompson, Agatha's longtime lawyer, a man with a face like worn leather and eyes that held all the warmth and sympathy of a tax audit. He was here to read her will, to deliver the final, carefully composed words of the woman who had composed my entire life. I sat on a stiff leather chair, my hands folded primly in the lap of my black dress, the same way she had taught me to sit for formal occasions. I was waiting to hear about the house, the savings, the portfolio of stocks she managed with such meticulous care. I was waiting for the final instructions on how to live the rest of my life without her. I was not prepared for the truth. I was not prepared for the fact that my life, the one I had so carefully lived, was not mine at all. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to suck all the remaining air out of the suffocating room. He adjusted the gold-rimmed glasses on his narrow nose and began to read from the thick, cream-colored parchment that represented the last will and testament of Agatha Monroe. The initial bequests were simple, predictable, and entirely in keeping with her character. A generous sum to the public library for the purchase of new books, a collection of antique porcelain figurines to a distant cousin in a different state whom I had never met, and a donation to the local botanical gardens to maintain the rose bushes she had so admired. I listened patiently, a dull ache of loss throbbing behind my eyes, my mind drifting to the quiet, orderly house that was now mine to manage alone. Then, Mr. Thompson paused. He laid a hand flat on the document and looked at me, a deliberate, unsettling gesture. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed through his dispassionate eyes. "The following section," he said, his voice as flat and dry as dust, "is a personal statement from Mrs. Monroe. It was her explicit instruction that it be read only in the event of her passing, and it is directed solely to you, Alina." I leaned forward, my breath catching in my chest. A fresh wave of sorrow washed over me, mingled with a bittersweet anticipation. This was it, her final goodbye, a last message of love and guidance from the woman who had been my everything. I braced myself for the familiar sting of grief, for the comfort of her final words. Instead, the lawyer read words that were not a balm, but a blade. They were not a comfort, but a curse. They were designed not to guide me, but to obliterate me. "To Alina," he began, his voice reciting Agatha's final testament without a trace of emotion, "who for 58 years has lived under my roof, eaten my food, and borne the name I gave to you. I feel it is time, now that I am beyond the reach of consequence or your tiresome emotional displays, to inform you of the truth of your existence. You are not, and have never been, my daughter." The room began to tilt. The paneled walls seemed to warp and bend, the portrait of some forgotten judge on the wall melting like a wax figure. I gripped the polished arms of the leather chair, my knuckles turning a bloodless white. I was certain I was having a stroke, a grief-induced hallucination. This was a nightmare. I would wake up in my bed, and the scent of lavender would still be in the air, and Agatha would be downstairs, arranging flowers in a vase. But Mr. Thompson continued, his voice a relentless drone, each word a nail being hammered into the coffin of my life. "Your name is not Alina Monroe. I do not know what your name was meant to be, because I made it a point never to learn it. It was irrelevant. You were a blank canvas upon which I was to paint my masterpiece." He paused to take a sip of water, the sound of his swallowing unnaturally loud in the ringing silence of my mind. "I took you," he went on, reading her venomous, triumphant prose, "on a cold November night in the year 1967. I walked into the maternity ward of St. Jude's Hospital, in a dreary little town you will never find, and I selected you from a room full of crying infants. Your mother was a woman I despised, a woman named Sarah, who possessed a simple, bovine happiness that I found deeply offensive. She had everything I believed I deserved by right of my superior intellect and breeding. She had a loving, handsome husband. She had a bright, untroubled future. And then she had you. My taking you was not an act of maternal desire. I have never felt such a primitive, messy emotion. It was an act of vengeance. It was a correction of a cosmic imbalance. I took her happiness, and I raised it as my own. The air in my lungs turned to stone. Every memory I had of her love, of her care, was instantly and irrevocably poisoned. The scraped knees she had cleaned and bandaged, the proud smile in her eyes at my university graduation, the gentle way she had brushed my hair as a child, all of it, every single moment, was a lie. A performance. An act in a play where I was the only one who didn't know the script. The will continued, a voice of pure, distilled malice reaching out from beyond the grave. I have raised you to be a testament to my superiority. You are my greatest creation. A life stolen and then meticulously reshaped in my own image. I gave you an excellent education, a comfortable home, a life free from the vulgar struggles of the common rabble. But let it be known, let it be seared into your consciousness, that it was a life you did not earn by birthright. It was a gift. A gift from the woman who systematically and intentionally destroyed your true family. I leave you the house and all its contents. I want you to live in it. I want you to sleep in the rooms where I planned your stolen future. Let every floorboard you walk on, every window pane you look through, be a constant, unending reminder that everything you are and everything you have is built upon the foundation of my spite and your profound, irreparable loss. My mind was a white noise of horror. I couldn't process the sheer scale of the cruelty, the decades of planning, the sheer, psychopathic dedication to a grudge. A final, devastating paragraph followed, the coup de grace of her posthumous assault. As for your real parents, Michael and the insipid Sarah, I believe they spent the better part of 2 decades searching for you. Their posters were in every shop window in that miserable town. I followed the news of their suffering with a certain detached, academic interest. Their grief eventually eroded their marriage, just as I predicted it would. Their lives were ruined by the void I so carefully authored. I imagine they are old now, if they are still alive. Perhaps they are even dead. It is of no consequence to me, and it should be of no consequence to you. You were my victory, and that is all you will ever need to know. Mr. Thompson finished reading. He carefully folded the parchment, tapped it on the polished surface of his desk to align the edges, and placed it back into a thick envelope. The silence that descended upon the room was heavier, more profound than any I had ever known. It was the silence of a life that had been utterly and completely erased. I looked at the lawyer, my eyes pleading for some sign of human feeling, of shock or pity or simple disgust. There was nothing. His face was a mask of professional neutrality. He had simply been the messenger, the conduit for Agatha's final, perfectly executed act of psychological warfare. Miss Monroe, he said, and the name felt like a costume, a heavy, suffocating garment I was being forced to wear. The estate will now proceed into probate. As stipulated, the house and its liquid assets are legally yours, free and clear. Do you have any questions for me? Questions? I had a million questions, a screaming vortex of them tearing my mind apart. Who am I? Where do I come from? Who is the woman who gave birth to me? Who was the father who searched for me? Are they alive? Do they know I exist? Do I have their eyes? But none of them could pass my lips. My throat was closed, my tongue thick and useless in my mouth. I could only shake my head, a small, jerky movement. Somehow, I managed to stand. My legs were trembling, unsteady. I stumbled out of the office, out of the oppressive silence, and into the blindingly bright afternoon sun. The world outside looked exactly the same as it had an hour before, but it was utterly, irrevocably alien. Every face in the crowd of strangers I passed on the street was a potential relative, a ghost from a life I had never lived. I searched their features for a hint of my own, for a chin, a nose, a set of eyes that I could claim as a birthright. I drove home, though the word home now tasted like ash in my mouth. I drove back to the house Agatha had left me, the stately, immaculate house I had always considered my sanctuary. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw it for what it truly was. It was not a home. It was a prison. It was a museum curated by my captor, dedicated to the 58-year exhibition of her greatest triumph. Me. I walked through the silent rooms, my hand trailing over the familiar furniture, the polished wood, the cool marble of the mantelpiece. My gaze fell upon the photographs that lined the walls, a visual history of my life. There I was, a smiling, chubby baby in Agatha's arms, a gap-toothed 7-year-old on a brand-new bicycle, a serious-faced teenager in a graduation gown, a grown woman standing beside Agatha in her garden. Every single image was a fraud. That wasn't my mother, smiling with love and pride. That was my kidnapper, smiling with the smug satisfaction of a predator who had successfully captured her prey. The love I had felt for her, the profound, all-consuming love that had defined my entire existence, began to curdle in my chest. It transmuted into something monstrous, a toxic, unbearable mixture of white-hot rage and a bottomless grief for a woman, my true mother, whom I had never known, and for the mother I thought I had, who had never truly existed at all. The Agatha I had loved and mourned was a character, a role she had played with chilling perfection for 58 years. The real Agatha was a monster who had waited until she was safely beyond my reach to finally, devastatingly, reveal her true face. She had ensured she would have the last word, the final, echoing laugh in the ruins of my life. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even turn on the lights. I sat in the suffocating darkness of the living room she had designed, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that had been a lie. Her final testament had been an act of pure psychological torture. She had not only confessed her crime, but she had done everything in her power to ensure I could never find my way back to the truth. No names of the town, just a hospital and a date. No last names for my parents, just Sarah and Michael. It was a needle in a continent-sized haystack, and she had gleefully burned the haystack to the ground before she left. For days, I drifted through the house, a ghost in my own life. I stopped answering the phone, ignoring the calls of condolence from Agatha's few acquaintances. I ignored the well-meaning neighbors who left casseroles and baked goods on the doorstep, their sympathy notes addressed to the grieving daughter of the wonderful and dignified Mrs. Monroe. How could I tell them the truth? How could I possibly explain that the woman they were mourning was a kidnapper, a sociopath who had orchestrated the ruin of at least 2 lives, and had then shattered a third with a posthumous confession designed for maximum cruelty? The sheer, calculated, long-term nature of it was what staggered me. She had waited until she was dead to tell me, ensuring I could never confront her, never scream at her, never look her in the eyes and ask her the one question that burned in my soul like a hot coal. Why? The will had provided her clinical, arrogant answer: spite, jealousy, a correction of a cosmic imbalance. But it felt too simple, too hollow to explain the sheer magnitude of a crime that spanned nearly 6 decades. It was the explanation of a demon. After a full week of living in a silent, gray fog of despair, a new feeling began to stir within the vast emptiness inside me. It was a tiny spark at first, a cold, hard ember of pure, unadulterated anger. Agatha had intended for this revelation to be the end of me. She had wanted me to live out the rest of my days in this beautiful prison, haunted by her memory and by the ghosts of the parents I would never know. She had written her perfect, tragic ending to my story. And as I sat there in the dark, staring at the empty space on the wall where her portrait used to hang, I decided, with a clarity that cut through the grief like a shard of glass, that I would not let her have the final say. I would not be her final victim. I would be her legacy's undoing. I would find them. I didn't care how long it took. I didn't care what it cost. I would dismantle her victory, piece by agonizing piece. I would find my real family. I would learn the name I was supposed to have been called. Agatha Monroe had started this story, but I, Anya Grace Vance, would be the one to finish it. My first act of rebellion was to wage war on the house itself. Not a war of rage and destruction, but a cold, methodical campaign of archaeological excavation. I was searching for a flaw in Agatha's perfect crime, a single, overlooked artifact from her life before me. She was a meticulous planner, a woman who kept records of everything, from grocery receipts to stock dividends. If there was a clue, a slip-up, a single piece of paper that could lead me to St. Jude's Hospital, it would be hidden somewhere within these walls. I started with her office, a room that had always been sacrosanct, her private domain. It was a monument to her organized, controlled life, with mahogany filing cabinets lining one wall, filled with decades of neatly labeled folders. I spent days, then a week, sifting through every single file, my hands covered in a fine gray dust, my eyes straining at the tiny, precise print of her handwriting and the faded ink of old documents. I was looking for a sign of a life before 1968, a connection to a past she had tried so hard to erase. I found nothing. Every document, every bank statement, every tax return seemed to begin in the year after she had taken me. It was as if her life had sprung into existence fully formed, with no history, no roots. There were no letters from old friends, no university yearbooks, no photographs of her as a young woman. It was a meticulously curated history, and I was its designated starting point. She had not only stolen my life, she had incinerated her own to cover the tracks. The frustration was immense, a physical weight in my chest. This was exactly what she would have wanted. For me to exhaust myself on a futile search, to be defeated by her superior planning. But I refused to give up. If the official paper trail was a dead end, I would have to search for something more personal, something she might have kept for sentimental reasons, even if those sentiments were rooted not in love, but in the perverse satisfaction of her victory. I moved on to her bedroom, a space that still smelled so strongly of her lavender perfume that I had to open the windows to breathe. I searched every drawer, every closet, every hatbox. Nothing. Finally, my eyes settled on the large, antique cedar chest at the foot of her bed, a place where she kept her quilts and fine linens. I had always been forbidden to open it as a child, told that it contained delicate fabrics that could be damaged by careless hands. I knelt on the floor and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of lavender and mothballs billowed out, a ghostly exhalation. I began to empty it, carefully at first, then with a growing sense of urgency, piling the hand-stitched quilts and embroidered pillowcases on the floor around me. My fingers brushed against the bottom of the chest, and I felt something hard and cold beneath the last layer of silk lining. It was a small, rectangular metal box, no bigger than a book of poetry. It was old, slightly rusted at the hinges, and it was locked. My heart began to hammer against my ribs with a force that was almost painful. This was it. This had to be it. There was no key in sight, so I went to the garage and returned with a hammer and a heavy-duty screwdriver. I wedged the tip of the screwdriver into the seam, and with a few sharp, brutal blows from the hammer, the old lock broke with a pathetic snap. The lid sprang open. I peered inside, my breath held tight in my chest. There was no grand confession, no letter of explanation, no map to my past. There was only a single, faded color photograph. It was a picture of a beautiful, radiant young woman with a smile that seemed to light up the entire frame. She was sitting up in a hospital bed, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a generic white hospital blanket. On the back of the photograph, in Agatha's neat, precise, and utterly chilling cursive, were 3 words: "My beautiful Anya." It wasn't a name meant to preserve my memory. It was a taunt, a trophy. Was Anya the baby, or was she the mother? I stared at the photo, at the joyful, unsuspecting woman, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was looking at the face of my real mother, Sarah. Agatha had kept a souvenir of the life she had destroyed. She had preserved the very moment before the devastation, the moment of purest joy, so that she could, I imagined, look at it over the years and savor the full scope of her crime. Beside the photograph in the box was another small, yellowed piece of paper. It was a newspaper clipping, carefully folded into a tiny square. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. It was a birth announcement from a newspaper called the Clarendon County Chronicle, dated November 12, 1967. The text was brief, just a few lines of type. To Michael and Sarah Vance, a daughter, Anya Grace, born November 10th at St. Jude's Hospital, 7 pounds 3 ounces. Anya Grace Vance. That was my name. For the first time since I had walked out of the lawyer's office, I wept. But these were not tears of grief for Agatha. They were not tears of confusion or despair. They were tears of profound, earth-shattering recognition. They were tears for the life I had lost, for the parents who had given me a beautiful name, for the baby in the photograph who had no idea that her world was about to be torn apart. And beneath the grief, there was something else, something fierce and new. They were tears of hope. Because now I had a name, I had a county, and I had a place to start looking. Agatha, in her supreme arrogance, in her need to keep a trophy of her victory, had made a fatal mistake. She had given me a weapon. My search, my real life, had just begun. The name echoed in the silent, lavender-scented room. Anya Grace Vance. It felt both utterly foreign on my tongue and as natural as my own heartbeat. It belonged to a baby in a photograph, but it also belonged to me. Holding that tiny, fragile newspaper clipping was like holding a key, not just to my past, but to my future. My first coherent thought was to flee. I had to get out of Agatha's house. The air was suddenly thick and suffocating with her presence, the lavender scent now cloying and sinister, the smell of my own cage. I grabbed the metal box, the photograph, and the clipping, and I drove. I had no destination in mind. I just needed to be in a place that wasn't tainted by her memory, a place where I could breathe. I ended up in a small, anonymous diner 20 miles out of town, the kind of place with cracked red vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone hun and kept the coffee coming without being asked. I sat there for hours, the coffee growing cold in front of me. I laid the photograph and the newspaper clipping on the sticky Formica tabletop, studying them as if they were sacred texts, the founding documents of my own lost nation. My mother, Sarah, she was so young, so vibrant, her face radiating a pure, unadulterated joy that was about to be so cruelly extinguished. My father, Michael. His name felt strong, solid, dependable. I repeated their names to myself over and over, a quiet mantra under my breath. Sarah and Michael Vance. They were my parents. The words were an anchor, a single point of stability in the churning chaos of my unraveled life. The rage I felt toward Agatha was a living thing inside me now. It was a cold, pure fire in my veins, burning away the fog of grief and despair. She hadn't just stolen a baby. She had stolen me. She had stolen me from them. From this smiling, beautiful woman and the man who had given me his name. She had watched them suffer, had perhaps even read the news of their desperate search with a perverse, scholarly sense of satisfaction. The will had said they searched for decades. The thought of their long, unending, unrelenting pain was a physical agony in my chest. That night, back in the house I now thought of only as a crime scene, I stood in the darkness and made a vow to the ghosts of my parents. I would not just find out what happened to them. I would reclaim the life I was supposed to have. I would find any family that was left. I would learn their stories, their histories, and when I was done, I would stand at Agatha's grave and I would tell her that she had failed. Her victory was a temporary illusion. My life was not over. In fact, it was just beginning. With the name of the county, the real work could start. Clarendon County. I had never heard of it. I opened the laptop that Agatha had bought for me, another one of her poisoned, calculated gifts, and typed the name into a search engine. The results were immediate. Clarendon County was a small, rural county about 300 miles north, nestled in the green foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It was a place of rolling farms, dense forests, and small, forgotten towns, a world away from the manicured, soulless suburbs where I had been raised. The county seat, according to the search results, was a town called Harmony Creek. My next search was for St. Jude's Hospital. My heart sank as the search engine corrected me. St. Jude's Community Hospital had been closed for almost 20 years. The building had been sold to a private developer and was now a complex of luxury condominiums called the Cloisters. A closed hospital meant lost records, scattered staff, a trail that had gone cold 2 decades ago. Agatha, the master strategist, had chosen her location well. A small, out-of-the-way place where a kidnapping would be a local tragedy, a shocking headline for a few weeks, but not a national story that would have the resources of the FBI behind it. But I had the newspaper, the Clarendon County Chronicle. I found their website easily enough. It was a modern, if somewhat basic, news site, but as I scrolled to the bottom of the page, my pulse quickened. There, in small blue letters, was a link, Digital Archives. For a monthly fee, I could access their entire history, every page of every issue, digitized from reels of microfilm. I paid for a lifetime subscription without a moment's hesitation. The interface was clunky, a digital imitation of an old microfilm reader at a library. I navigated to the archives for November 1967. I scrolled through the pages, the digital facsimiles of the old newsprint flashing before my eyes. I passed local news about a dispute over a new stoplight, high school football scores, advertisements for Thanksgiving turkeys at the local grocer. And then I found it. It wasn't on the front page. On November 12th, the story was still developing. It was on page 3, a small, single-column article near the bottom. The headline read, "Newborn Girl Missing from St. Jude S." My hands started to shake so badly I could barely control the mouse. I read the article, my breath held tight in my chest. It described how a new mother, Mrs. Sarah Vance, had woken up in the early hours of the morning to find the bassinet beside her hospital bed empty. A nurse, it was reported, had seen a woman in a volunteer's pink-striped uniform leaving the maternity ward with a bundled infant about an hour earlier, but had assumed she was a relative. The description of the woman was chillingly, infuriatingly vague: medium height, brown hair, wearing a plain winter coat over the uniform. It could have been anyone. It could have been and was Agatha. The article quoted my father, Michael Vance. His words, even filtered through the dry prose of a provincial newspaper, were raw with panic and disbelief. "Someone has my daughter," he had told the reporter, his voice breaking. "We just want her back. We won't ask any questions. Please, just bring Anya home." Reading my own name, my real name, in the context of my father's desperate, heartbroken plea broke something open inside of me. This was real. This wasn't just a story in a dead woman's will. It was a documented tragedy. These people, my parents, had been real, their pain had been real, and it had been printed in black and white for the entire world to see. I kept scrolling through the archives, my obsession growing with every click. Day by day, week by week, I followed the story of my own disappearance. The story of the missing Vance baby quickly moved to the front page. There were pictures of my parents, their faces etched with an agony that was almost impossible to look at for long. Sarah, my mother, looked frail and shattered, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to swallow her whole. Michael, my father, had his arm wrapped tightly around her, his expression a mask of grim, desperate determination. He organized search parties. He pleaded with the public on the local television station, his voice cracking with emotion. The whole town of Harmony Creek seemed to rally around them, their collective shock and horror palpable even through the decades-old newsprint. The articles detailed the police investigation, which was a litany of dead ends and missed opportunities. They had no real leads. The woman in the volunteer's uniform had vanished without a trace. No one had gotten a good look at her face. The uniform itself was a generic item that could have been easily acquired. Agatha had been a ghost. She had slipped in, taken what she wanted, and slipped out, leaving a crater of devastation in her wake. As the weeks turned into months, the story began to shrink. The headlines became smaller. The articles moved from the front page back to page 3, then to the back pages, buried among classified ads and legal notices. The updates became less frequent, more perfunctory. No new leads in Vance kidnapping. Vance family still hopeful for daughter's return. 1 year later, a community still wonders. I found an article published on the first anniversary of my abduction. It featured a new photograph of my parents, standing in front of their small, well-kept house. The year of unrelenting grief had hollowed them out. The youthful light in my mother's eyes was gone, replaced by a haunted, vacant look that was 1,000 years old. My father looked harder, older, the lines on his face deeper. His arm was still around her, but it looked less like a gesture of comfort and more like he was the only thing physically holding her upright. Their quotes were heartbreaking. "We live every day in a nightmare," my mother had told the reporter, her voice barely a whisper. "I still hear her cry sometimes at night. It's a phantom sound, I know, but I go to her room and the crib is empty. It's always empty." My father's words were filled with a burning, impotent rage. "Whoever did this," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are not a human being. You are a monster. You didn't just steal a child. You murdered a family, but I want you to know this. We will never stop looking for her. Never." But Agatha, from the comfort of her suburban home 300 miles away, had been right. They did eventually stop, or rather the world stopped watching. The articles became sparse, then stopped altogether. The story of the missing Vance baby faded from the news, becoming a piece of local history, a ghost story told to frighten children into behaving. I kept digging. I searched for their names in the archives for the following years, my search now a desperate attempt to piece together the rest of their lives. I found them mentioned sporadically. Michael Vance, a local building contractor, was involved in a town council dispute over zoning regulations. Sarah Vance had started a support group for parents of missing children, a small act of defiance against the crushing weight of her own loss. Then, in 1985, 18 years after I was taken, I found the public record I had been dreading since I first read Agatha's will. A divorce notice. Michael Vance versus Sarah Vance. The grounds were listed as irreconcilable differences. Agatha's final, cruel victory. She had not only stolen their child, she had stolen their marriage, their future, the love that had been so evident in that first, joyful photograph from the hospital. The grief had been a slow-acting poison that had finally, inexorably, torn them apart. Now I had a new, more urgent question. Where were they now? Were they still alive? I started with my father, Michael Vance. His name was more common, but his profession, a contractor, helped to narrow the search. I found business listings for Vance & Son Construction in Harmony Creek, Clarendon County. The business was now listed as permanently closed. The & Son part of the name caught my attention, a pang of something I couldn't name. Did I have a brother? Had my parents had another child after me? Or was this a son from a later marriage? I found a more recent record, an online obituary from 3 years ago. The screen went blurry as I read the words. Michael Vance, beloved husband, father, and grandfather, had passed away at the age of 78 after a short illness. I was too late. My father was dead. He had died without ever knowing what had happened to his daughter. He had gone to his grave with a hole in his heart that I should have, been there to fill. The grief was sharp and sudden, a physical blow that knocked the air from my lungs. I had been an orphan my entire life, but somehow this felt like being orphaned all over again, a second, more terrible loss. The obituary listed his survivors: his loving wife of 30 years, Patricia; his son, David Vance; and 2 grandchildren, Emily and Jacob. I had a brother, a half-brother, and a stepmother, and a niece and a nephew. A family, a real family, a family that had no idea that I existed. The obituary included a recent photograph of my father. He was an old man, his hair white and thin, his face full of wrinkles, but his eyes were kind, and I could still see the determined young man from the newspaper clippings in the set of his jaw. I stared at his picture, my heart aching with the weight of all the years we had lost, the conversations we would never have. Now my search focused on one person, a single, desperate hope: Sarah Vance, my mother. Her name was harder to trace after the divorce. She would have likely changed it if she had remarried. I searched for her name connected to the support group she had founded, but it seemed to have disbanded in the early 90s. I hit a wall. For days, I searched every combination of her name I could think of, in every public records database I could find, but there was nothing. It was as if she had vanished from the face of the earth. I was beginning to lose hope, beginning to fear that she too was gone, when I had a new idea. I went back to my father's obituary. It mentioned that in lieu of flowers, donations could be made to the Clarendon County Historical Society. It was a long shot, a desperate, grasping straw in the wind, but maybe, just maybe, someone there would remember the Vance family. Maybe they had old records, or high school yearbooks, or something, anything, that could give me a clue as to where my mother had gone. I found the phone number for the Historical Society and dialed it, my hand trembling so much I could barely press the numbers. An elderly woman with a cheerful, crackling voice answered on the third ring. Clarendon County Historical, Beatrice speaking. How can I make your past present? Hello, I said, my own voice sounding weak and unsteady, a stranger's voice. My name is Eleanor. I'm doing some family research. I was wondering if you have any information on a family that used to live in Harmony Creek, the Vance family, Michael and Sarah Vance. There was a significant pause on the other end of the line. The cheerful tone in the woman's voice softened into something more somber. Oh my, Beatrice said, her voice dropping. The Vances, of course, I remember them. Everyone who lived here then remembers them. Such a terrible, terrible tragedy. That poor, sweet couple. It just broke this whole town's heart right in two. You knew them? I asked, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Everyone knew them, she said with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades. Michael was a good man, built half the houses on Elm Street with his own 2 hands. And Sarah was just a ray of sunshine. Before it happened anyway, it changed her. It would change anyone, I suppose. It was like a light went out inside her. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I'm trying to find Sarah. I know they divorced. Do you have any idea what happened to her after that? Oh, that's a sad story, dear, Beatrice said, and I could hear the genuine sympathy in her voice. She left town not long after the divorce, couldn't stay here any longer. We heard she moved downstate, closer to the city. Said there were too many ghosts in Harmony Creek for her. I can't say I blame her. Every street corner, every shop window in this town must have reminded her of that baby girl. My hope, which had been burning so brightly, began to falter. So you don't know where she went? Well, now, I didn't say that, Beatrice said, and I could hear a smile returning to her voice. Sarah was a dear friend of my younger sister, Mary. They kept in touch for years after she left, sent Christmas cards back and forth, that sort of thing. Mary passed on a few years back, God rest her soul, but I was the one who helped clear out her house, and I kept all her old address books. I'm a bit of a pack rat, you see. My husband always says so. Let me see if I can find it for you. Hold on the line, dear. I waited, my entire world hanging in the balance of a dead woman's address book. I could hear her rummaging in the background, humming a cheerful, off-key tune to herself. It felt like an eternity, each second stretching into a miniature lifetime of suspense. Aha, she exclaimed, her voice triumphant. Here we are, Vance Sarah. Oh, but she remarried, you see. A good man, from what Mary told me. Her name is Sarah Carmichael now, has been for 30-odd years. She gave me the address. It was in a town called Oak Ridge. I typed the name into the map application on my phone, and my blood ran cold. It was only 50 miles away. 50 miles from where I was sitting right now. 50 miles from Agatha's house. For decades, my mother had been living just an hour's drive away from me. Agatha must have known. The thought was sickening, a fresh wave of horror in an ocean of it. She must have tracked her, must have known where she lived. She must have tortured herself with the knowledge that Sarah had found some measure of happiness again, and that knowledge would have been a constant, private source of fuel for her hatred. Thank you, I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. Thank you, Beatrice. You have no idea what this means to me. You've given me everything. Always happy to help a budding historian, she said cheerfully. You let me know if you find anything interesting you hear. I hung up the phone, my body shaking with a mixture of raw terror and wild, unbridled elation. I had an address. I had a new name. My mother was alive. She was real. And she was close. But what now? What in God's name was I supposed to do? Could I just drive to this house and knock on the door? What would I say? Hello, I know this is going to sound completely insane, but I believe I am the daughter who was stolen from you 58 years ago. She would think I was a madwoman. She might have a heart attack on her front porch, and what if she didn't want me? What if she had built a new life, a happy, peaceful life, and the appearance of a ghost from her traumatic past would only bring her a fresh hell of pain? The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand gripping my heart. For my entire life, I had been the daughter of Agatha Monroe. A quiet, orderly, unassuming woman. Now I was supposed to be Anya Grace Vance, the long-lost daughter, the center of a tragic, sensational story. I had no idea how to be that person. I spent the next 2 days pacing the floors of Agatha's house, a prisoner of my own fear and indecision. On the third day, I woke up and my eyes fell on a framed portrait of Agatha that still hung in the hallway, one I had missed in my initial purge. Her painted eyes were smug, self-satisfied, condescending. It was the look of a victor. And that was all it took. My fear was burned away by a sudden, clarifying blast of rage. I would not let Agatha win. I would not let her posthumous manipulations and my own anxieties stop me from reclaiming my life. My mother, Sarah, deserved to know the truth. She deserved to know that her daughter had not vanished from the face of the earth, but had been living a lie just a few miles down the road. She deserved to know that she was not crazy for hearing a baby's cry in the empty nursery of her mind. I took the portrait from the wall, carried it out to the stone patio in the backyard, and I smashed it to pieces with a rusty garden spade. Then, I got in my car and I started driving toward Oak Ridge. I had no plan. I had no speech prepared. I didn't know what I would find or what would happen, but I knew I had to go. I was going to find my mother. I was going to tell her my name, my real name. The 50-mile drive to Oak Ridge was the longest, most surreal journey of my life. Each mile marker that flashed past my window felt like a year of my stolen existence, a countdown to a moment that would either be a reunion or a final, devastating rejection. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, and my heart beat a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of terror and hope. What if she slammed the door in my face? What if her new life was so complete that my reappearance would be nothing more than an unwelcome disruption, a wound she had no desire to reopen? Agatha's cruel, condescending voice echoed in the cavern of my mind, a final, mocking whisper from the grave. She is better off without you. Her new life is a testament to my success. I did her a favor by removing you. I pushed the insidious thought away, focusing on the road, on the image of the smiling young woman in the photograph clutched in my hand on the passenger seat. That was my mother. The woman who had given me a name, even if I had never had the chance to hear her say it. The woman whose joy had been the catalyst for Agatha's lifelong, monstrous crime. Oak Ridge was a pretty town, quiet and green, with wide, tree-lined streets and well-kept houses that spoke of comfortable, settled lives. It was the kind of place where people grew old, where families put down deep roots. Following the calm, disembodied voice of the GPS on my phone, I turned onto a street called Maple Lane. It was a picturesque tunnel of towering oak trees, their leaves forming a dappled, golden-green canopy over the road. And then I saw it, the house number that Beatrice had read to me over the phone. The house was a modest, single-story home, a cheerful shade of yellow with crisp white trim. A stone path, flanked by blooming flower beds, led to a welcoming front porch that held a wooden swing and several large ceramic pots overflowing with vibrant red geraniums. The garden was immaculate, a riot of color and life, clearly tended by a loving and patient hand. It was a happy house, a peaceful house. A house that held no outward trace of the 58 years of unrelenting grief I knew its owner had endured. I parked my car across the street, my courage, which had felt so absolute when I smashed Agatha's portrait, suddenly failing me. I couldn't just walk up there. I needed a moment. I needed to see her first to prepare myself for the reality of her, so I waited. For almost an hour, I sat in the driver's seat of my car, watching the house, feeling like a stalker, a spy in my own life. And then the front door opened. A woman came out, carrying a small gardening trowel and a wicker basket. She was wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat that shaded her face. She was older, slender, with soft white hair cut in a neat, stylish bob. She moved with a gentle, deliberate grace, kneeling down with a soft groan to tend to a bed of yellow roses that grew near the porch steps. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, painful intake of air. Even from across the street, even with her face partially obscured by the hat, I could see it. It was in the elegant line of her jaw, the delicate slope of her nose, the way she tilted her head as she worked. It was the face from the photograph, softened and lined by the passage of time, but unmistakably, miraculously, the same. It was Sarah. It was my mother. Tears began to stream down my face, hot and silent. I watched her, this complete stranger who was the most familiar person in the world, as she carefully snipped a dead bloom from a rose bush and placed it in her basket. She looked content, peaceful. The sight of her quiet, hard-won happiness was both a profound comfort and a sharp, twisting knife to the heart. Agatha had not completely destroyed her. She had survived. She had built this new life, this beautiful garden, from the ashes of her unimaginable loss. Was I about to arrive with a match and set it all on fire? For a long, agonizing moment, I almost put the car in reverse. I could drive away, leave her to her peace. I could live with the precious knowledge that she was alive and well, and perhaps that would be enough. But then I looked down at the metal box on the passenger seat, at the photograph of her younger, joyful self, her eyes shining with love for the baby in her arms. That woman, the one whose life had been so brutally derailed, deserved to know that her baby had survived, too. We both deserved the truth. We both deserved a chance at an ending to our story that wasn't written by Agatha Monroe. I opened the car door, my legs feeling like they were made of lead as they swung out onto the pavement. I walked across the street, up the stone path, my heart hammering so hard against my ribs that I thought it might burst through my chest. She didn't notice me until I was standing just a few feet away, casting a shadow over her rose bush. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun with a dirt-stained, gloved hand. Her eyes were a soft, gentle blue, crinkled at the corners from years of smiling, or perhaps from years of weeping. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice pleasant, a little cautious, the voice of a woman addressing a stranger who has appeared unexpectedly in her front yard. My own voice, when it finally came out, was a choked, pathetic whisper. Are you Sarah Carmichael?" A flicker of caution, the natural wariness of a person of her generation, crossed her face. "I am," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And you are?" I had rehearsed a dozen opening lines in the car, a dozen ways to gently broach this impossible subject, but they all vanished from my mind in a puff of panic. I fumbled in the large purse I was carrying and pulled out the small, rusted metal box. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the broken latch. I took out the faded photograph and held it out to her, my hand trembling like a leaf in a storm. "I found this," I said, my voice cracking with the strain. I'm trying to find the people in it. I was told you might be able to help me. She took the photograph, her brow furrowed in polite confusion. She looked down at it, and in that instant, the world seemed to stop turning. The polite, neighborly smile on her face dissolved as if wiped away by an invisible hand. The healthy color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pale, ashen gray. Her hand flew to her mouth, and the small gardening trowel fell from her other hand, clattering loudly against the stone path. She stared at the picture, her eyes wide with a dawning horror and a wild, terrified disbelief. Where in God's name did you get this? She breathed, her voice a raw, broken sound that bore no resemblance to the one she had used just moments before. It was the voice of a ghost. The woman who raised me, she passed away recently, I explained, the words tumbling out of me in a frantic, incoherent rush. She left it for me. In her will, she told me a story. Sarah's gaze lifted from the photograph. Her blue eyes, now swimming with tears, searched my face, really seeing me for the first time. They scanned my features, my eyes, my mouth, my hair, as if trying to solve an impossible puzzle, to reconcile the face of the middle-aged stranger in front of her with the ghost of the baby she had held in her arms for a single, perfect day. I could see the decades of pain, of buried hope and crushing despair, swirling in their depths. What story? She whispered, her gaze locked on mine, her entire body trembling. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the moment of truth, the moment that had been hurtling towards me for weeks, finally upon me. She told me that my name wasn't a Leaner. She told me that she took me from St. Jude's Hospital in Clarendon County, on the night of November 11th, 1967. A strangled sob, a sound of pure, undiluted agony, escaped her lips. She leaned heavily on the white porch railing for support, her gloved knuckles turning white. She told me, I continued, my own tears starting to fall again, hot and fast, that my real name is Anya Grace Vance. The name hung in the air between us, a fragile, impossible bridge across 58 years of silence and pain. For a long, heart-stopping moment, she didn't speak. She just stared at me, her face a canvas of shock, grief, and a wild, terrified, incandescent hope. It was the look of a woman who is seeing a ghost and is praying with every fiber of her being that it is real. Then slowly, as if moving through water, she raised a trembling hand. She reached out and gently, tentatively touched my cheek. Her fingers were cool through the thin fabric of her glove, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing. It was the first time my mother had touched me since I was a day old. Anya, she whispered, the name a sacred, broken thing on her lips. She said it again, a little louder this time, as if testing its reality, its weight in the world. Anya. And then, the dam of a lifetime of suppressed grief, of hope deferred and dreams destroyed, finally broke. She collapsed into my arms, her body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the very center of the earth, from a well of pain so deep I couldn't fathom it. I held her, my own arms wrapping around this small, fragile woman who was my mother. I was holding my entire history, my identity, my past, and my future, all in this one, shuddering embrace. We stood there in the beautiful, sun-drenched garden, two strangers, mother and daughter, weeping for a lifetime of stolen moments, for the 58 years that Agatha Monroe had taken from us. After what felt like an eternity, her sobs subsided into ragged, hitching breaths. She pulled back slightly, but her hands still clutched my arms, as if she were afraid that if she let go, I would vanish into thin air. She looked at my face, her own face streaked with tears and dirt from the garden, but for the first time I saw the ghost of a smile, the same radiant, joyful smile from the photograph, emerge through the mask of her pain. I knew it, she whispered, her voice filled with a strange, fierce, vindicated certainty. All these years. They told me I was mad. The doctors, your father, they all thought I should just move on. But at night, I would hear you cry. I swear to God, I always heard you. I knew you were out there somewhere. I knew you weren't gone. She looked at me then, her eyes full of a love so profound, so unconditional, it took my breath away. It was a love that had survived half a century of silence and separation, a love that had refused to die. You have your father's eyes, she said, her voice thick with a fresh wave of emotion. She reached up and with a trembling hand tucked a stray strand of graying hair behind my ear. Her hand lingered on my face, a touch that was both a greeting and a farewell to all the lost years. The front door of the cheerful yellow house opened, and a man who looked to be in his late 70s, with kind, worried eyes and a full head of white hair, stepped out onto the porch. Sarah, is everything all right? I heard crying. He stopped short when he saw us. his gaze taking in the bizarre, emotionally charged scene his wife, her face a mess of tears, clinging to a strange woman who was also crying. "It's her, Tom," Sarah said, turning to him, her voice ringing with a joy that was almost painful in its intensity. "It's her. She's come home, it's my Anya. She's come home." She turned back to me, her grip on my arms tightening, her eyes shining with a light I thought had been extinguished forever. She looked past the wrinkles, past the gray in my hair, and in that moment I know she saw the baby she had lost. "Come inside," she said, her voice full of an urgent, desperate, all-encompassing love. "Come inside, child. Come inside and tell me everything." Walking across the threshold of my mother's house was like stepping through a tear in the fabric of reality, into a life I was supposed to have lived. The air inside smelled of lemon polish and freshly baked bread, a scent of domestic comfort that was both profoundly welcoming and deeply, achingly foreign. Her husband, Tom, a kind-faced man with a gentle, bewildered demeanor, watched us with a stunned silence, his mind clearly struggling to process the impossible scene unfolding on his front porch. Sarah, my mother, never let go of my hand. She led me through the living room as if I were a precious, fragile object she had just found after a lifetime of searching, a priceless vase she was afraid of dropping and shattering all over again. The room was filled with the evidence of a life well lived, a life that had moved on. It was filled with photographs. On the mantelpiece, on the side tables, lining the walls in mismatched frames. Pictures of Tom and Sarah on vacation, smiling in front of snow-capped mountains and turquoise oceans. Pictures of a smiling young man and woman with 2 small children, my half-brother David and his family, I realized with a sudden, dizzying jolt. This was my family. These were my people. And then I saw it. On a small, antique table in the corner, set slightly apart from the others as if on a small altar, was a single, silver-framed photograph. It was a professional portrait of a newborn baby, her face serene, her eyes closed in sleep. It was me. "I never put it away," Sarah said, her voice soft and thick with tears following my gaze. "Tom, he thought it would be best, after a while, to help me move on. The therapists all said the same thing, but how can you move on from your own child? It felt like a betrayal, so I kept it here. Every morning for 58 years, I've said good morning to you, and every night I've said good night. I told myself that as long as your picture was here, you were still a part of this house. You were still with me." I reached out a trembling hand and touched the cool glass of the frame, my heart aching with a grief so profound it felt bottomless. While I had been living my sterile, emotionally stunted life as a Leaner Monroe, my mother had been keeping a quiet, lonely vigil for Anya Vance. She had kept a space for me, not just in the deepest recesses of her heart, but right here, in her home, for all the world to see. Tom approached us slowly, his initial shock giving way to a cautious, protective concern for his wife. "Sarah, honey," he said, his voice gentle. "Who is this woman? What's going on?" "It's Anya," she said again, the name a constant, joyous miracle on her tongue. "The woman who took her, she told her everything. She's been living just an hour away from us, Tom, all this time. She's been right here." Tom looked at me, then at the faded photograph in my hand, the one of a young, radiant Sarah holding her baby in the hospital bed. He looked back at my face, his eyes wide with a dawning, stunned comprehension. "My God," he whispered, his gaze moving between my face and the photograph. "The resemblance, it's uncanny." We sat on the comfortable, floral-patterned sofa, Sarah still clutching my hand as if it were a lifeline. I told them everything. I told them about Agatha Monroe, about the cold, sterile, loveless life I had led, a life rich in material comfort, but utterly devoid of genuine warmth or affection. I told them about the will, the final, venomous confession, the rusted metal box, the desperate search through the newspaper archives, and the final, miraculous discovery of my name. I told them about my father, Michael, and the obituary I had found online, my voice breaking as I recounted the pain of discovering I was 30 years too late to meet him. At the mention of Michael's name, a deep shadow of old, unresolved pain crossed Sarah's face. "He was a good man, your father," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He never, ever stopped loving you, not for a single day. The loss, it broke us." We were 2 different people, adrift in the same storm, but in different boats. We grieved in opposite ways. He wanted to lock the pain away, to build a wall around it and try to build a new life. I couldn't. Every day without you was a day I couldn't breathe. In the end, the grief was a chasm between us, and we couldn't find our way back to each other. She told me about the decades of searching, the false leads, the cruel hoaxes, the so-called psychics and expensive private investigators who took their money and their hope and gave them nothing but empty promises in return. She told me about the slow, agonizing process of accepting that she might never know what had happened, of learning to live with the gaping, unhealable wound in her soul. She told me about meeting Tom, a kind and patient widower who had loved her through her darkest days of grief, even when he couldn't fully understand its suffocating depth. But I never really gave up hope, she said, her blue eyes burning with an ancient, unquenchable fire. Not in my heart of hearts, I buried it deep. It was the only way to survive the day-to-day. But it was always there, a little pilot light, waiting for a reason to flare up again. That afternoon, after the initial storm of tears and explanations had passed, we made the decision to call my half-brother David. Sarah's hand shook as she dialed his number, her face a mixture of joyous anticipation and nervous apprehension. "David," she said, her voice unsteady as soon as he answered. "You need to come over. Right now, something has happened, something wonderful and impossible." An hour later, a man who looked to be in his early 40s with my father's kind, deep-set eyes and a strong, stocky build walked through the front door. His expression was one of filial concern, but it quickly turned to confusion when he saw me sitting on the sofa next to his mother, a stranger in their familiar living room. "Mom, what's going on? You sounded strange. Is everything okay? Who's this?" Sarah looked at me, her eyes shining with a fresh wave of tears. She took my hand and his, joining them together in her lap. "David," she said, her voice breaking with the sheer, overwhelming emotion of the moment. "This is your sister. This is Anya." The silence that followed was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket of disbelief. David stared at me, then at his mother, then back at me, his mind clearly reeling. I could see him searching my face, just as Sarah and Tom had done, looking for a piece of his father, a piece of the family puzzle that had always been tragically, inexplicably missing. "Anya," he repeated, the name sounding foreign and strange in his mouth. The baby. Dad's baby, but how is that possible?" And so, once again, for the third time that day, I told my story. As I spoke, I watched the disbelief in David's eyes slowly melt away, replaced by a profound, heart-wrenching sadness for the father he had known, for the sister he had never had the chance to meet. When I finished, he didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored my own and with the ghosts of a father I would never know. "My father," he said finally, his voice thick and choked with unshed tears. "He talked about you. Not often. It was too painful for him, I think. But sometimes, late at night, when he thought I was asleep, I would hear him talking to Mom about you. And after they divorced, sometimes he would tell me about the daughter he had lost. He said it was like losing a limb. You learn to live without it, but you never, ever stop feeling the phantom pain of it not being there. He would have, God, he would have given anything to have known you were alive and okay." The knowledge that my father had never forgotten me, that he had carried my memory and his grief for me with him until the day he died, was both a profound comfort and a fresh, agonizing source of pain. I had been loved. I had been mourned. My existence had mattered deeply. That evening was a surreal, emotional whirlwind. I met David's wife, Jenny, a warm and compassionate woman who looked at me with tears in her eyes, and their 2 children, Emily and Jacob, my niece and my nephew. They were shy at first, these children who had grown up hearing the whispered, tragic ghost story of their lost aunt. But Emily, who was 8 years old and had my mother's bright, inquisitive blue eyes, eventually came and sat beside me on the sofa, her small legs not quite reaching the floor. "Are you really our Aunt Anya?" she asked, her voice a small, curious whisper. "I am," I said, my voice catching in my throat, the simple truth of it still feeling like a miracle. She smiled, a gap-toothed, wonderful, uncomplicated smile. "I'm glad you came home," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That night, I didn't go back to Agatha's house. I couldn't. The thought of sleeping under that roof again, in that monument to cruelty, was unbearable. Sarah insisted I stay with them, in the cozy guest room at the back of the house, a room filled with colorful, hand-stitched quilts she had made herself. Lying in that comfortable bed, in my mother's house, surrounded by the quiet, unfamiliar sounds and smells of a living, breathing family, I felt a sense of peace and belonging that I had never known in my entire 58 years. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly, completely home. The next few weeks were a blur of introductions and discoveries, a dizzying, emotional crash course in the family I had never known. I met aunts, uncles, and cousins who had all heard the story of the lost baby. They welcomed me with tearful hugs and open arms, eager to share their stories and old photographs, to fill in the 58-year gap in my life and in theirs. Each new face was a new piece of myself, a new connection to the family, the heritage that had been stolen from me. A few days after my arrival, David took me to the cemetery where my father was buried. We stood before his grave on a gray, windy afternoon. It was a simple granite headstone that read Michael Vance, loving husband, father, and grandfather. He should have known, David said, his voice raw with a grief that was still fresh. He deserved to know you were okay. It would have given him such peace. I placed a bouquet of yellow roses, my mother's favorite, on his grave. I think he does now, I whispered, the wind whipping my hair across my face. I spoke to him then, to the father I had never known, a quiet, one-sided conversation. I told him that I was home, that his wife and his son were taking care of me, that he didn't have to worry or grieve for me anymore. With the unwavering support of my new family, I began the difficult, painful, but necessary task of dismantling the life that Agatha Monroe had built for me. We hired a lawyer, a sharp, compassionate woman who specialized in unique family law cases. She was horrified and fascinated by my story in equal measure. She helped me begin the legal process of reclaiming my name. The day I stood before a judge and signed the official papers to change my name from Alina Monroe to Anya Grace Vance was one of the most profound and liberating days of my life. I was shedding a false identity, a name that had been a cage, and I was finally, officially, stepping into the truth of who I was always meant to be. The next and final step was the house, Agatha's house. I couldn't live there. I couldn't even bear to be in it for more than a few minutes at a time. But I couldn't just sell it either. Not yet. It was a crime scene, a monument to her cold, calculating cruelty. I decided, with my mother and brother by my side, to empty it of every last trace of her. We rented a large van. We packed up her clothes, her books, her collection of antique porcelain figurines. We donated every last thing to charity, without ceremony. We erased her from the space she had so carefully curated, just as she had tried to erase me from my own life. But we kept one thing. In her office, tucked away in the very back of a filing cabinet, in a folder ominously labeled contingencies, we found a collection of journals. Bound in dark green leather, they were filled with Agatha's neat, precise cursive. She had chronicled her entire life, her thoughts, her resentments, her meticulous, diabolical planning. We found the entries from 1967. Reading them was like looking directly into the cold, black heart of a monster. She wrote of her burning, obsessive jealousy towards Sarah, a woman she had known only casually through a charity league they both belonged to. She described my mother as insufferably happy, with a perfect, unexamined life that she felt Sarah, in her simple, guileless goodness, didn't deserve. The kidnapping was not a spontaneous, desperate act, as I might have imagined. It was a carefully planned, coldly executed operation. She had volunteered at the hospital for weeks, learning the routines of the maternity ward, charting the nurses' schedules, even stealing a volunteer's uniform. She had chosen me, not out of a desperate, misguided desire for a child, but specifically because I was Sarah's child. I was the perfect, helpless instrument of her long-simmering revenge. The journals were filled with a chilling, narcissistic satisfaction. She wrote about reading the news of my parents, suffering with a sense of detached, academic triumph. She had even driven through Harmony Creek a few times in the early years, a secret tourist in the lives she had so completely destroyed. The final entry, written just a week before she died of the cancer she had told no one about, was the most chilling of all. "Soon it will be time for the final act of my play," she wrote. "Alina will learn the truth. She will learn that her entire pathetic life has been a performance, and I have been the director, the writer, and the producer. The knowledge will crush her fragile, unformed spirit. She will live out her days in this house, a ghost haunted by a life she never had. She was my masterpiece, my perfect, beautiful, lifelong revenge, and with her despair, it will finally be complete." Reading those words, I did not feel crushed. I felt a surge of cold, righteous, liberating anger. She had not won. Her final act of cruelty had not been an ending, but a beginning. It had been the catalyst for my own freedom. I took the journals, along with a copy of Agatha's will, to the Clarendon County Police Department. The original case of my kidnapping was still technically open, a cold case gathering dust for nearly 60 years in their archives. A young, determined detective named Miller was assigned to it. He read Agatha's journals over the course of a weekend. His expression, he later told me, growing darker and more disturbed with every page. "This is the most diabolical, cold-blooded thing I have ever read in my life," he said when he called me. "She may be dead, but we can still close this case. We can give your family the justice they were denied for so long." With Agatha's own meticulously detailed confession in her journals, the case of the missing Vance baby was officially solved. The name of Agatha Monroe was entered into the official record as a kidnapper and a felon. My name, Anya Grace Vance, was officially listed as the victim who had been, after 58 long years, recovered. It was a legal formality, a piece of bureaucratic paperwork, but it was more than that. It was the truth, finally written down in black and white for the entire world to see. A few months later, I sold Agatha's house. I took the considerable amount of money she had left me, and I used it to start a foundation in my father's name. The Michael Vance Foundation for Missing Children, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families with the financial and emotional resources they needed to find their lost loved ones. My mother and I worked together, pouring our shared pain and our miraculous reunion into a new, shared purpose. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost a year to the day that I had knocked on her door, my mother and I stood on the porch of her cheerful yellow house, watching the red and gold leaves fall from the old oak trees that lined the street. "Do you ever hate her?" I asked quietly, the question one I had been wanting to ask for months. Sarah was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, looking at a past I could only imagine. "I used to," she said, her voice soft but strong. "For so long, the hate was all I had. It was a poison that I drank every day, but it was also what kept me going, what kept me from completely falling apart. But now," she turned to me, her blue eyes clear and full of a love that was as bright and steady as the afternoon sun. "Now, when I think of her, I almost feel pity for her. She lived her whole, long life in the dark, consumed by her own jealousy and bitterness. She never knew what it was like to truly love someone, to feel the kind of joy you feel when you hold your own child. She stole you from me, but she could never have what I have now." She took my hand, her grip warm and strong, the hand of a survivor. "She tried to steal my joy, she tried to steal my daughter, but in the end, she failed. You're home, Anya, you're finally home." In that moment, standing on the porch of my mother's house, her hand in mine, I knew she was right. Agatha Monroe had authored a story of vengeance and pain, a story she thought she had perfected. But we, my mother and I, had written the final chapter. It was a story of survival, of resilience, of a love so powerful it could cross a lifetime of silence to find its way home. My life as Alina Monroe had been a long, cold, lonely winter, but spring had finally, miraculously, come. And in the warmth of my mother's love, in the loud, messy, beautiful embrace of the family I had finally found, I was beginning to bloom.